It was supposed to be a lively political panel, just another day of debates, quick zingers, and headline-making one-liners. Karoline Leavitt, sharp as ever, was fielding questions with confidence. She wasn't new to political banter. In fact, she was known for her wit. And that day, she decided to lean into it. Comment where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. It started like most political forums do. A packed hall, bright stage, lights, a lineup of commentators and public figures ready to weigh in on everything from policy to personal brand. Among them sat Karoline Leavitt, confident and articulate, known for her sharp takes and polished presence. She wasn't just there to talk points. She was there to own the room. Across from her sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, equally poised, equally confident, but with a different energy, more rooted, more grounded. Their styles couldn't be more different, and perhaps that's what made what followed so striking. The moderator shifted the conversation toward youth engagement in politics. It was a softball moment, an opportunity to say something inspiring, perhaps drop a memorable line. Karoline leaned in slightly, her hands folded neatly on the table. With a smile playing at the edge of her mouth, she delivered a line that she clearly thought would land well. "Well," she said, with just enough pause to draw attention, "at least I'm not out here giving TikTok energy like Jasmine Crockett." The room burst into laughter. It was the kind of line that gets clipped for social media, a sound bite with punch. A few of the panelists chuckled. The moderator gave a knowing nod, and even a few audience members clapped softly. It was quick, snappy, and had just the right tone of sarcasm to feel like a joke without crossing a clear line, or so it seemed in the moment. Jasmine didn't react immediately. Her expression didn't change. She kept the same steady gaze, her lips tight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. For a moment, it looked like she was going to let it go, maybe even let the moment pass entirely. But something happened, something small yet deeply noticeable. From the front row of the audience, an older man in a dark gray suit sat quietly, his hands folded. He had been watching everything, not just listening to the words, but observing every shift in tone, every expression on stage. He didn't move during the laughter. He didn't flinch when Karoline delivered her jab. But once the crowd's chuckles began to fade, he stood up slowly, quietly, without saying a word. He didn't wave or call out. He didn't make a scene. But the sheer presence of him rising in that moment caught the attention of nearly everyone in the room. It wasn't dramatic. It was human, and it carried a weight no one had prepared for. Karoline saw him. Everyone did. And while his expression was calm, there was something undeniable in his eyes, a silent disapproval, not of politics or policy, but of how easily people forget the line between critique and personal mockery. For those who didn't know, the man was Jasmine Crockett's father, a proud man, deeply supportive of his daughter's work, yet never one to seek attention. He had come that day just to watch, just to listen. But the moment Karoline turned a policy discussion into a public dig aimed at Jasmine's personality and style, the moment laughter filled the room at his daughter's expense, he felt the need to act, not with outrage, not with a speech, but with presence. Karoline's smile faded slightly. She looked away for a second, then back at the table, adjusting the microphone in front of her as if to regain footing. It wasn't a collapse. She didn't panic. But the rhythm shifted, the air changed and everyone felt it. The laughter didn't last long. It came in waves, first loud, then hesitant, and finally awkwardly fading into silence. What had seemed like a clever jab was now lingering in the air a little too long. People shifted in their seats. Some looked at each other, uncertain whether to laugh again or just wait for the moment to pass. But it didn't pass. Not yet. That's when he stood up. No one saw him rise at first. It was quiet. No dramatic gesture, no sound, just a slow, deliberate movement as Jasmine Crockett's father stood from his seat in the front row. He was a tall man with silver threading his hair in a posture that commanded attention even in silence. His suit was neatly pressed, his expression unreadable, but it was the timing that made the entire room freeze. The panelists noticed at first. Karoline Leavitt, in the middle of her confident grin, turned her eyes slightly toward the audience and caught the movement. Her expression changed, not dramatically, not in panic, but with a flicker of awareness. Jasmine also looked up, her eyes locking with her father's for a moment. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He didn't speak. He didn't scowl. He simply stood there, his eyes on the stage, his hands still by his side, but the weight of his presence did what no words could have done. It drained the room of its energy. People who were laughing moments ago now found themselves awkwardly quiet. A few turned to see who he was. Others simply looked away, suddenly unsure of what had just happened. There's a particular kind of silence that only arises when people realize they may have laughed too easily, too quickly, and maybe at the wrong thing. That was the silence now swallowing the space. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was realization. Jasmine's father didn't need to say a word to make people understand something important had been overlooked. The comment, while clever, had made light of his daughter in a way that felt personal, and now confronted with the quiet dignity of her father's response, the tone shifted completely. Karoline looked down for a moment, her fingers tapping softly on the table, her confidence tempered, not broken, but undeniably altered. This wasn't a tweet she could brush off, or a headline she could spin. This was real in the room human consequence, the kind of moment politicians rarely face because they so rarely have to witness the emotional impact of their words in real time. And Jasmine, she didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at her father, nodded once, and returned her gaze to the panel. It was clear they had an understanding, the kind that runs deeper than politics. He had stood not to shield her, not to make a point, but to remind everyone in the room, including her, that behind every name tossed around on a panel stage is a real person with a real family who feels every word. The moderator tried to steer the conversation back to policy, fumbling slightly with his notes, the usual flow of the event now broken. He muttered something about moving on, and good points made. But even his voice lacked the ease it had just 5 minutes ago. No one interrupted. No one joked. It was clear that something had changed. The cameras caught all of it, not just the comment, not just the reaction, but the moment that followed. The moment a father stood without speaking, and reminded an entire room with nothing but presence that words carry weight, even when they're said with a smile. The shift in the room was almost imperceptible at first, a subtle unraveling of the mood that had carried the panel until that point. After Jasmine Crockett's father rose from his seat and stood silent, no one quite knew how to proceed. There were no raised voices, no calls for apology, no confrontation, but the atmosphere changed. Every person on that stage and many in the audience felt it in their bones. He remained standing for a full minute, long enough for discomfort to settle in, long enough for people to realize this wasn't about spectacle, it was about presence. His presence and what it said without needing to say anything at all. There's something powerful about quiet resolve, something more striking than outrage. That was what Jasmine's father brought to the moment. He didn't ask for attention, yet everyone gave it to him. He didn't demand respect, yet everyone instinctively offered it. His calm demeanor was not passive, it was intentional, measured, purposeful. Eventually, he sat back down, still silent, still composed. But even as he lowered himself into his seat, the mark had been made. Karoline Leavitt, now visibly aware of the tension, had retreated into a more reserved version of herself. She glanced his way again, not out of defiance, but almost as if trying to gauge how deeply the joke had landed. It was no longer about winning the moment. It had become about understanding it. The panel continued. Technically speaking, the moderator, after a brief pause, introduced a new topic, something to do with community initiatives. But the flow wasn't the same. The momentum had shifted. People chose their words more carefully. The laughter didn't come as easily. The room, once buzzing with light banter and confident exchanges, had settled into something more thoughtful, reflective. What was remarkable wasn't just the fact that Jasmine's father stood, it was how that one action reframed the entire space. It became clear that people weren't just listening to what was said anymore, they were listening to how it was said. The audience now looked for intent behind every comment, every glance, every smile. The silence he brought with him stayed, not in volume, but in influence. Karoline eventually spoke again, her voice steady but softened. She answered a question about civic engagement, this time steering clear of personal digs. She talked about bridging generational gaps, about understanding perspective. Whether it was a deliberate shift or an instinctive one, it was noticed. Her tone had changed, not out of fear, but from a quiet recognition that the line between performance and people had been crossed, if only briefly. And Jasmine, she remained composed. Her posture didn't shift. She didn't offer commentary on what had happened. She didn't address the joke, the laughter, or her father's quiet gesture. But her silence was no longer passive either. It mirrored his. She let the moment speak for itself, and it did. After the event, as people began to file out, several attendees passed by the front row. Some nodded respectfully at Jasmine's father. A few even stopped to shake his hand. He didn't offer long explanation or engage in political talk. He simply thanked them, smiling politely, maintaining the same quiet dignity he had held all along. What he had done, without speaking a word, was shift the emotional center of the room. He reminded everyone that beyond the titles and the sound bites were people, daughters and fathers, families and history. He didn't need a microphone or a spotlight. He brought the weight of presence, and in doing so reminded even the sharpest voices on that stage that real power often comes from restraint. In the days following the panel, the video clip circulated rapidly online. At first it was the joke that made headline, Karoline Leavitt's TikTok energy remark aimed at Jasmine Crockett. The snappy line was clipped, captioned, and shared like most political quips in today's media cycle. But something interesting began to happen. As the clip spread, people started to notice not just the joke, but the moment after, specifically the man who stood. At first, viewers didn't know who he was. Comment sections filled with speculation. Who's the man in the gray suit? Why did he stand like that? Was that her father? It didn't take long before the identity was confirmed. He was indeed Jasmine Crockett's father, and then the narrative shifted entirely. People weren't just sharing a political jab anymore. They were sharing a moment, the rise, the silence, the way the energy in the room changed, without him uttering a single word. That clip was replayed over and over, not for outrage, but for reflection. What stood out wasn't that he had demanded an apology. He hadn't. He didn't raise his voice or challenge anyone publicly, but his silent response sparked a larger conversation. In interviews and on social media, commentators began to discuss what it meant to treat public discourse with dignity, even in the face of mockery. The power of restraint suddenly became a talking point, not because it was flashy, but because it was rare. Karoline, to her credit, responded. Days after the event, she posted a short video on her official page. Her tone was measured, different from her usual confident delivery. She didn't double down on the joke. She didn't make excuses. She said simply, "Sometimes a moment catches you off guard. That day I got caught up in the room in the performance of it all. But watching that man, watching him stand, watching what he stood for, it reminded me that behind every debate is a person, and behind every person a family." It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but it was honest, and it landed with people. Jasmine, on the other hand, never addressed it publicly. She was asked about it in interviews and brushed it off with quiet professional. "The work is bigger than moments," she said once, "and I try not to give moments more weight than the mission." But those close to her say she was deeply moved, not by what was said on stage, but by her father's quiet act of solidarity. For her father, the moment was never about confrontation. He hadn't planned to stand. He wasn't making a statement for the cameras. He later told a reporter, "I didn't rise to protest. I rose because I saw my daughter being reduced to a caricature, and I needed her to know in that moment that she wasn't alone." That sentence, simple and grounded, resonated far beyond the political world. His response became something of a symbol. Teachers used the clip in classrooms to discuss nonverbal communication and emotional intelligence. Faith leaders mentioned it in sermons about dignity and integrity. Parents talked about it with their kids. It was proof that one doesn't need a podium to lead. Sometimes leadership looks like standing quietly when it matters most. The panel had started as just another political event, but it ended up becoming a reminder of the unseen layers beneath the surface of public life. While policy was discussed and sound bites exchanged, it was the stillness of a father that taught the most lasting lesson, not just about family or respect, but about the ripple effect of a moment done right in a world that too often rewards the loudest voice instead. In the end, the panel wasn't remembered for the policies debated or the zingers delivered. It was remembered for the quiet interruption of one man who said nothing, and in doing so said everything. Moments like these are rare in public discourse, where the loudest voice often drowns out the most meaningful message. Yet somehow, it was silence that carried the greatest weight. Jasmine Crockett's father didn't rise to shame or scold, and he didn't stand out of anger. He stood to show presence, to remind the room, and perhaps his daughter most of all, that she wasn't there alone, and she wasn't unseen. It was a gesture that didn't need explanation, because its power was in its simplicity. For Karoline Leavitt, it may have been a humbling experience, but also a defining one. Politicians often speak of authenticity, of being real and relatable. But authenticity isn't just confidence. Sometimes it's humility, and she showed a measure of that in her quiet acknowledgement after the event. She didn't retreat into defensiveness, nor did she ignore what had taken place. She recognized it, sat with it, and let it shift her perspective. That kind of self-awareness, though rare in politics, is not weakness, it's growth. For Jasmine Crockett, the moment affirmed something deeper. Her refusal to react in anger or seek attention proved that strength isn't always in the counterattack. Sometimes it's in stillness, in holding space, in allowing others to reveal who they are through how they treat, and trusting that people are watching. And for her father, the man whose presence redefined the room, his legacy in that moment isn't one of drama, but of dignity. His action echoed far beyond that hall. It became a reminder that he doesn't need to be loud, that support can be silent, and that sometimes the most powerful protests are the ones done without a single word. This wasn't a story of scandal. It wasn't a meltdown, a confrontation, or a viral moment meant to inflame. It was simply real, a story of how humanity can still surface in the most structured, rehearsed, and image-conscious of spaces. People will forget the talking points, the back and forth, the sound bites crafted for headline, but they will remember the silence. They'll remember the man who stood without speech, and in doing so reminded everyone in that room on both sides of the aisle that behind every microphone sits a person, and behind every person is someone who believes in them, even when the world is laughing. That more than anything is what made the moment unforgettable.